Imagine living in France in the late 18th century. You walk into a bakery, the bread is expensive. You look at your purse, there is hardly any money left. You look around, people are hungry. And then you look towards Versailles, a magnificent palace, golden halls, lavish celebrations. The royal court lives in extraordinary luxury. The contrast is almost unbearable. Outside the palace, people are struggling to survive. Inside, the monarchy continues spending. Now imagine discovering something even more disturbing. You are not simply poor, you are also paying most of the taxes. And the people who possess enormous wealth and privilege, many of them enjoy major exemptions. This is the France of 1789, a society divided by birth, a government drowning in debt, a population increasingly influenced by ideas of liberty and equality, and a king who needs money desperately but cannot raise it without confronting the very society that benefits from the old system. The situation is becoming impossible. France is sitting on a volcano, and all it needs is a spark. That spark comes in 1789, and once the explosion begins, Europe will never be the same again. Chapter 1, Causes of the French Revolution. The French Revolution did not happen because of one bad harvest. It did not happen because people suddenly became angry. It happened because several crises collided at exactly the wrong moment. Think of it like a pressure cooker. The pressure had been increasing for decades. Then the lid finally exploded. The first problem, an unequal society. French society was divided into three estates. The first estate consisted mainly of the clergy. The second estate consisted mainly of the nobility. The third estate included almost everybody else, including peasants, workers, artisans, merchants, professionals, the emerging middle class, and the bourgeois. The problem? The first two estates enjoyed significant privileges. The third estate carried much of the tax burden. This created a profound sense of injustice. Imagine being told you are equal as a human being but not equal as a citizen. That contradiction would soon become politically explosive. The second problem, the financial crisis. France was spending more than it earned. Wars had been extremely expensive. France had supported the American colonies against Britain during the American War of Independence. That weakened Britain's position, but it also worsened France's own financial condition. The monarchy was drowning in debt. The government needed money, but taxation was deeply unequal. Attempts to reform the tax system repeatedly faced resistance from privileged groups. The monarchy had reached a dangerous point. It needed to reform, but the people benefiting from the system opposed reform, and the king lacked the political strength to impose it. The third problem is the food crisis. Then nature made everything worse. Poor harvests in the late 1780s contributed to rising food prices. Bread became increasingly expensive. For ordinary people, bread was not a luxury, it was a basic necessity. When bread prices rise sharply, hunger becomes political. People who can survive inflation for a few months may become desperate when they cannot feed their families. By 1789, economic hardship had created an angry population. But anger alone does not create a revolution. People also need an alternative vision, and France had one. Chapter 2, Enlightenment. Imagine living under an absolute monarch. Now someone tells you government exists for the people. Another says people possesses natural rights. Another argues political power should be separated. And another says why should birth determine political privilege? These ideas were revolutionary. The Enlightenment had challenged traditional authority through reason and criticism. John Locke emphasized natural rights and government based on consent. Montesquieu argued for separation of powers. Rousseau emphasized popular sovereignty and the general will. These thinkers did not create the French Revolution by themselves, but they provided its intellectual vocabulary. The revolutionaries could now express their anger not merely as hunger but as injustice, not merely as opposition to a king but as opposition to arbitrary authority. This distinction matters enormously. The French Revolution was not simply a rebellion, it was an attempt to create a new political order. And now France was about to enter the most dramatic year in its history. Chapter 3: The Revolution in France. King Louis XVI was desperate for money. In 1789, he called the Estates General, a representative body of the three estates. The meeting began at Versailles, but the third estate had a problem. Voting traditionally took place by estate. That meant the privileged first and second estates could potentially outvote the third estate. The third estate refused to accept this arrangement. On 17 June 1789, it declared itself the National Assembly. Its message was powerful. The nation was not the king, the nation was the people. Then came the dramatic tennis court oath on 20th June. The representatives pledged not to disperse until a constitution had been established. The political revolution had begun. Then Paris exploded. On 14 July 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that had become a symbol of royal despotism. The Bastille's military importance was limited. Its symbolic importance was enormous. The people had demonstrated that royal authority could be challenged by force. 14 July became the great symbol of the French Revolution. Then came another transformation. In August 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Its principles were revolutionary: liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, rights. The old order was being dismantled. Feudal privileges were abolished. The political language of Europe had changed. But revolution rarely remains controlled. Next comes the chapter 4: From Constitutional Monarchy to Republic. At first, revolutionaries did not necessarily demand the abolition of monarchy. Many wanted a constitutional monarchy. The king would remain, but his powers would be limited. France adopted a constitution in 1791. Yet trust between the king and the revolutionaries deteriorated. The monarchy became increasingly associated with counter revolution. War added another layer of danger. France went to war with Austria and Prussia in 1792. Foreign monarchies feared that revolutionary ideas would spread. French revolutionaries feared invasion and internal betrayal. The atmosphere became increasingly radical. On 10th August 1792, revolutionaries attacked the Tuileries Palace. The monarchy was effectively suspended. The National Convention was elected. France became a republic. Then came one of the most shocking events. On 21st January 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. The revolution had crossed a point of no return. France was now fighting foreign enemies. It was fighting internal rebellion, and revolutionary factions were fighting one another. The revolution entered its most violent phase. Chapter 5: The Reign of Terror. Imagine starting a revolution in the name of liberty and eventually executing people merely for being suspected enemies of the revolution. This was the terrifying contradiction of the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, associated strongly with Maximilien Robespierre, became extremely powerful. The revolutionary government attempted to defend the republic from foreign invasion and internal opposition. Thousands were executed. The guillotine became a symbol of revolutionary violence. The revolutionaries believed extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. But there was a deeper problem. Once political violence becomes acceptable, who would decide who the enemy is? Today it may be a royalist, tomorrow a moderate revolutionary, the next day a former ally. Eventually, Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed in 1794. The terror ended. But France remained unstable. The revolution had destroyed the old political order without yet creating a stable replacement. A new government, the Directory, was established in 1795. It struggled with corruption, economic difficulties, political instability, and war. France desperately needed order, and one military officer was waiting in the wings. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 6: France under Napoleon. Napoleon understood something very important. People wanted both the achievements of the revolution and stability. In 1799, Napoleon seized power through the coup of 18 Brumaire. The revolutionary government was replaced by the consulate. Napoleon eventually became first consul. Then, in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of France. At first glance, it looked like the revolution had failed. A new emperor after overthrowing a king? But Napoleon was more complicated. He preserved several revolutionary principles while destroying political freedoms. His famous achievement was the Napoleonic Code or Civil Code of 1804. It established important principles such as equality before the law, protection of property, abolition of feudal privileges, secular legal principles, greater uniformity of the law. For the bourgeois, this was enormously important. Napoleon also reorganized administration. He strengthened the state, improved taxation, expanded education, established institutions such as Bank of France. But politically, he became increasingly authoritarian. Freedom of the press was restricted, political opposition was suppressed. France had exchanged one form of centralized authority for another. Yet Napoleon's greatest impact came through war. His armies conquered enormous parts of Europe, and wherever they went, they carried revolutionary legal and administrative changes. Feudal privileges were weakened or abolished in many territories. Old aristocratic structures were challenged. National consciousness grew. Ironically, Napoleon spread the ideas of the French Revolution while simultaneously ruling as an emperor. Chapter 7, Napoleon's Fall. Napoleon's power seemed almost unstoppable, but empires often contain the seeds of their own destruction. The first major problem was overexpansion. Napoleon attempted to dominate Europe through military force. The invasion of Russia in 1812 became catastrophic. The enormous distance, harsh winter, Russian strategy of retreat and scorched earth, supply problems, all destroyed much of Napoleon's army. European powers regrouped. Napoleon was defeated and abdicated in 1814. He returned briefly in the famous Hundred Days. Then came the final defeat, Waterloo 1815. Napoleon was sent into exile on St. Helena. The Napoleonic era has ended, but the revolution had already changed Europe. There was no returning completely to the world of 1788. Chapter 8, The Impact of French Revolution. The French Revolution produced enormous consequences. The first was political. The principle of popular sovereignty gained strength. The idea that political authority ultimately belongs to the nation became increasingly influential. Second, the idea of equality before law spread. Legal privileges based on birth were increasingly challenged. Third, feudalism was weakened or abolished in many parts of Europe. Fourth, nationalism gained momentum. People increasingly began thinking of themselves as members of a nation rather than merely subjects of a monarch. This would later influence the unification movements of Germany and Italy. Fifth, the revolution inspired political movements beyond Europe. Its ideals crossed borders. Liberalism gained strength. Constitutionalism gained strength. The language of rights became increasingly powerful, but there was also a darker impact. Revolutionary violence demonstrated how political ideas could become dangerous when combined with extreme polarization. The terror became a warning about the dangers of political absolutism in the name of revolutionary purity. Next comes the chapter 9, Significance of the French Revolution. Now step back, forget the guillotine, forget Napoleon, forget Versailles. Look at the bigger picture. Before 1789, European society was deeply hierarchical. After 1789, a new political language has emerged: liberty, equality, fraternity. These three words became symbols of modern political thought. The French Revolution challenged the assumption that rulers possessed unquestionable authority. It strengthened the idea that government should derive legitimacy from the nation. It weakened feudalism. It strengthened citizenship. It spread secular political institutions. It contributed to the development of modern nationalism. And it demonstrated the enormous power of ordinary people when political and economic grievances converge. But perhaps its greatest significance lies in one simple transformation. Earlier, people were largely viewed as subjects of rulers. The revolution increasingly promoted the idea of citizens possessing rights. This is a monumental change. A subject asks, "What does the king allow me to do?" A citizen asks, "What are my rights?" That difference lies at the heart of modern democracy. Now comes the grand finale. The French Revolution began as a crisis of the French monarchy, but it became a revolution in political thought. It began with bread. It became a struggle over representation. It became a constitutional movement. It became a republic. It became the terror. It produced Napoleon. And finally, it transformed Europe. The irony is extraordinary. The revolutionaries wanted to destroy absolute power. Napoleon eventually accumulated enormous power himself. The revolutionaries wanted liberty. The terror restricted liberty. They wanted equality. Napoleon created a centralized empire, and yet, despite these contradictions, the idea survived. The monarchy could return, Napoleon could fall, armies could be defeated. But an idea once released into society is difficult to imprison. Liberty, equality, citizenship, popular sovereignty, rights. These ideas continued traveling. They inspired movements across Europe. They influenced Latin American independence. They shaped modern nationalism. They contributed to constitutional government and they changed the way humans thought about political authority. The French Revolution, therefore, was not simply the story of France overthrowing a king. It was the moment when a question became impossible for the world to ignore. If all human beings possess dignity, why should political power belong permanently to a privileged few? That question did not end in 1789. It traveled across continents. It entered the 19th century. It influenced nationalism, liberalism, and democratic movements. And eventually, its echoes would reach the colonies of Asia and Africa, including India, because the modern world was no longer asking merely who rule us. It had begun asking something far more dangerous. Why should anyone have the right to rule us without our consent?